It was late at night, and the streets were quiet. Officer Mike Dillard and Officer James Carter had been on patrol for hours. The shift had been slow, with only a few minor incidents. As they drove down a dimly lit road, they noticed a black car ahead. It switched lanes without signaling, and that was enough reason for them to pull it over. Flashing their lights, they signaled the driver to stop. The car slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road smoothly. The officers parked behind it, and Dillard stepped out first. He placed his hand on his belt, where his radio and other equipment were, as he approached the driver's window. Carter followed closely behind, watching from the other side of the car. Inside, a black woman sat calmly in the driver's seat. She was dressed in professional clothes, her posture straight and her expression unreadable. As the window rolled down, she looked up at Dillard with quiet confidence. "Good evening, officer," she said, her voice steady. "License and registration." Dillard responded, his tone neutral but firm. Without hesitation, she reached into her bag and pulled out her driver's license. Then, she opened her glove compartment and retrieved the car's registration. She handed both over with a polite nod. Dillard glanced at them, noting the name, Monica Harris. It didn't ring any bells. "Do you know why we pulled you over?" Carter asked from the other side. She tilted her head slightly. "No, officer. Could you please tell me?" "You switched lanes without signaling back there," Dillard said, pointing toward the road behind them. She nodded. "I see. I apologize if I made a mistake." Her calmness was unusual. Most people they pulled over reacted with nervousness, excuses, or frustration. But this woman, she wasn't arguing, panicking, or over-explaining herself. She simply waited, watching them closely. Dillard studied her for a moment, then handed her license to Carter. "Run this through the system," he said. Carter took the ID and walked back to the patrol car. Meanwhile, Dillard remained by the driver's side, observing her. Something about her was different, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. A moment later, Carter's voice crackled over the radio. "No warrants. Clean record." Dillard should have just let her go with a warning, but something made him hesitate. Maybe it was the way she seemed too calm. Maybe it was just instinct. "Step out of the vehicle," he said. Her expression didn't change. "May I ask why, officer?" "We need to check something," Dillard replied vaguely. She sighed softly, then unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door. As she stepped out, she stood tall, her confidence unshaken. Dillard expected her to show some fear, some frustration, but she didn't. Carter walked back, now standing beside Dillard. "Everything looks fine," he whispered. But Dillard wasn't ready to let her go just yet. Something about her was bothering him, though he couldn't explain why. And that's when the night took an unexpected turn. Monica Harris stood beside her car, her hands resting at her sides. The night air was cool, and the street was quiet except for the low hum of the police car's engine. Officer Dillard glanced at his partner, then back at her. Something about her calmness unsettled him. Most people in this situation would ask more questions, argue, or at least look nervous. But she just stood there, waiting. Carter handed back her license and registration. "Everything checks out," he said. Dillard wasn't satisfied. He felt like he was missing something. "Do you have anything in the vehicle we should know about?" he asked. Monica raised an eyebrow. "Like what, officer?" "Anything illegal," Dillard said vaguely. She gave a small smile, but it wasn't one of amusement. "No, I don't." "Mind if we take a look?" Carter asked. Monica's expression didn't change. "Yes, I do mind," she said firmly, "unless you have a reason or a warrant." Dillard's jaw tightened. He didn't like that answer. Most people, even if they knew their rights, hesitated before refusing. But she had said it so clearly, without fear. "We can call in for backup," Carter muttered to Dillard, just loud enough for Monica to hear. Monica folded her arms. "That won't be necessary. If you're done with me, I'd like to be on my way." Dillard exhaled slowly. He had two choices: let her go or find a reason to keep her there. His gut told him there was something off about this woman, but he had no proof, no cause to hold her. He was about to step back when Carter spoke. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to turn around," he said. Monica's eyes flickered with something. Was it disappointment? She didn't argue, didn't resist. She simply nodded, turned around, and placed her hands behind her back. Dillard pulled out his handcuffs and locked them around her wrists. "You're being detained for obstruction," Dillard said, though his voice lacked confidence. Monica let out a soft sigh. "Obstruction. You refused to let us search your vehicle," Carter said quickly. "That's not obstruction," she replied smoothly. "That's my legal right." Dillard shifted uncomfortably. He knew she was right, but it was too late to backtrack now. Carter opened the back door of the patrol car, and Monica stepped in without a fight. The door closed behind her with a quiet click. For the first time that night, Dillard felt uneasy. There was something about the way she carried herself, the way she spoke, like she knew something they didn't, like she was in control, even in handcuffs. As they drove toward the station, the silence in the car grew heavy. Monica sat in the back seat, looking straight ahead, saying nothing. And for some reason, that silence made Dillard more nervous than anything else. The ride to the station was quiet. Officer Dillard kept glancing at the rearview mirror, expecting the woman to protest, to demand answers. But Monica Harris sat in the back seat with a calm expression, her hands cuffed in her lap. She didn't look angry. She didn't look scared. She just waited. That bothered Dillard more than if she had yelled or argued. People who got arrested usually had some kind of reaction. Fear, frustration, confusion. But she didn't. It was like she knew something they didn't. Carter cleared his throat. "So, Miss Harris, you live around here?" he asked, trying to make small talk. Monica turned her head slightly. "Why does that matter?" Carter shrugged. "Just trying to be friendly." Monica gave a small nod but said nothing else. The rest of the drive was silent. When they reached the station, Dillard parked the car and got out. Carter opened the back door, helping Monica step out carefully. Even in handcuffs, she moved with dignity, like she wasn't worried at all. Inside the station, the fluorescent lights cast a cold glow over the booking area. A few other officers were at their desks, writing reports or talking on the phone. As Dillard and Carter walked Monica in, a desk clerk looked up. His eyes widened for a split second before he quickly looked away, pretending to focus on his paperwork. Dillard noticed the reaction but didn't think much of it. "Sit here," he told Monica, gesturing to a bench near the wall. She sat down without a word. Carter went to the computer to start the booking process while Dillard stood nearby, arms crossed. "Full name?" Carter asked, even though they had her ID. Monica sighed. "Monica Harris. Age? 43. Carter typed the answers into the system. A few desks away, a sergeant suddenly looked up. His eyes flicked to Monica, then to the screen on Carter's computer. His face went pale. "Wait a minute," the sergeant muttered, standing up quickly. He walked over, staring at the name on the screen. Then he looked back at Monica. "Is there a problem, Sergeant?" Dillard asked. The sergeant ignored him. Instead, he turned to Monica. "Judge Harris." His voice was a mix of shock and disbelief. Dillard blinked. "Judge." Carter's hands froze over the keyboard. "Judge Harris," he repeated, his face turning red. Monica met their stunned expressions with the same calm gaze she had carried all night. "Yes," she said simply. "Judge Monica Harris." A heavy silence fell over the room. The other officers had stopped what they were doing. Some exchanged looks, some stared at Dillard and Carter in disbelief. The two officers felt their stomachs drop. They had just arrested one of the most respected judges in the city. And now, they had to deal with the consequences. A heavy silence filled the booking room. Officer Dillard and Officer Carter stood frozen, their minds racing. "Judge?" "Judge Monica Harris." The woman they had handcuffed and brought in was a judge. The surgeon's face was tense as he turned toward them. "What in the world are you two thinking?" he asked sharply. His voice wasn't loud, but the disappointment in it was clear. Dillard's throat went dry. She refused to search," he stammered. Judge Harris, still seated on the bench, looked at him with calm eyes. "Because I had the legal right to," she said simply. Carter, his face turning pale, took a step back. He suddenly remembered why her name had sounded familiar. He had seen it on case files. He had heard other officers talk about her. Judge Monica Harris was known for being fair but firm in her courtroom. She had handled cases involving officers before. Some had praised her, and some had complained about her strict adherence to the law. The sergeant let out a sharp breath. "Take those cuffs off. Now." Dillard hesitated, but he knew there was no way out of this. He stepped forward, pulled out the key, and unlocked the cuffs. The moment they clicked open, Judge Harris slowly rubbed her wrists but didn't say anything. For the first time that night, she looked disappointed. Not angry, not afraid, just disappointed. That made Dillard feel worse than if she had yelled. The sergeant turned to her. "Judge Harris, I sincerely apologize for this," he said. His voice was respectful, almost nervous. Judge Harris stood up, adjusting her sleeves. "I assume I'm free to go now?" she asked. "Of course, ma'am," the sergeant said quickly. "No charges, nothing on record. This was a terrible mistake." Judge Harris didn't respond right away. She turned to look at Dillard and Carter, studying them carefully. "Tell me something," she said finally. "Would you have treated me the same way if I were someone else, if I didn't have this title?" Neither officer spoke. Dillard wanted to say yes, of course, but the words wouldn't come out, because deep down, he wasn't sure. Judge Harris gave a small nod, as if she already knew the answer. "I'll see you both again very soon," she said. Carter gulped. What do you mean?" But Judge Harris didn't answer. She turned and walked toward the exit. The moment she stepped out, the tension in the room finally broke. Officers whispered among themselves. The sergeant shook his head. Dillard felt his stomach twist. He didn't know exactly what was going to happen next. But one thing was certain. This wasn't over. The next few days were filled with tension. Officer Dillard and Officer Carter couldn't focus on their work. Everywhere they went in the station, other officers gave them looks, some curious, some amused, and some full of quiet judgment. No one said anything directly, but the whispers followed them. Those of the guys who arrested Judge Harris. What were they thinking? She's not going to let this slide. Dillard tried to ignore it, but he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in his gut. Something was coming. He just didn't know what. Then the call came. That morning, both he and Carter were ordered to report to the courthouse immediately. The message was short, but the meaning was clear. Their actions had reached higher authorities, and now they had to face the consequences. As they walked into the courthouse, their footsteps echoed through the long, polished hallways. It was a place Dillard had been many times before, but today felt different. Today, he wasn't here as an officer handling a case. He was here because he was the case. They were directed into a large room. Several other officers, department officials, and legal representatives were seated, and at the front of the room, sitting behind the bench, was Judge Monica Harris. She looked just as calm as she had the night they arrested her. Her eyes scanned the room before settling on them. Dillard swallowed hard. Carter shifted uncomfortably beside him. "Officers," Judge Harris began, her voice steady and clear. "Do you know why you're here today?" Neither of them answered. She sighed, setting a document down in front of her. "Let's start with the facts. You stopped me for a minor traffic violation. You checked my record and found nothing. Yet despite that, you detained me. When I exercised my legal right to refuse a vehicle search, you arrested me under false charges." Carter's face turned red. "We weren't trying to." Judge Harris raised a hand, stopping him. "I'm not here to argue. I'm here to ask a simple question. She leaned forward slightly. "Would you have done the same if I were someone else?" Dillard's mouth opened, but no words came out. Judge Harris studied their expressions. "This is not just about me," she continued. "This is about the responsibility that comes with wearing that badge. The trust the public places in you, and how quickly that trust can be broken." The room was silent. Then she picked up another document and handed it to a clerk. "This is what's going to happen," she said. "You will both be required to undergo extensive training on proper procedure, bias awareness, and ethical policing. This will not be optional." Dillard exhaled slowly. It could have been worse. Much worse. But Judge Harris wasn't finished. "You will also be evaluated for further disciplinary action by the department." Carter flinched. "Does that mean we're getting suspended?" Judge Harris didn't answer right away. She looked at them one last time before saying, "That decision is not mine to make. But one thing is certain. This will not be forgotten." Dillard felt the weight of those words settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a lesson. And the whole world was watching to see if they had learned it. The hearing was over, but the consequences had just begun. Officer Dillard and Officer Carter left the courthouse with heavy steps. The air outside felt different, heavier, filled with something unspoken. They had expected some punishment, but now the reality of it was sinking in. Back at the station, everything felt off. Some officers avoided them, while others threw them quick, knowing glances. A few even shook their heads as they passed. The story had spread. Dillard sat at his desk, staring at the notice in front of him. Mandatory training. Bias awareness. Ethical policing. He exhaled sharply and tossed the paper onto the desk. Carter slumped in the chair beside him. "This is bad," he muttered. Dillard shot him a look. "You think?" Carter ran a hand through his hair. "We didn't know who she was. If we had known." "That's the problem," Dillard interrupted. His voice was lower now, more frustrated. "If we had known, we wouldn't have treated her that way. But that means we would have treated someone else differently." Carter didn't reply. The truth was uncomfortable. The next morning, they reported to the training center as instructed. The room was filled with officers from different precincts, but all eyes were on them. Their mistake had made headlines. Now, they weren't just regular cops. They were examples. The instructor, a senior officer with years of experience, walked in and started the session. "Today, we're going to talk about power, bias, and responsibility." His eyes swept over the group. "Because whether you realize it or not, your badge comes with all three." Dillard sat up straighter, listening. The instructor continued, "Every day, people judge you based on that uniform. They assume you will do the right thing. And you assume things about them too, sometimes without even knowing it." A screen lit up behind him, showing clips of real police encounters, some handled correctly, others leading to serious mistakes. Then the screen changed again. It showed their case. The footage from the station. Judge Monica Harris, sitting on the bench, her wrists red from the cuffs. Carter stiffened beside Dillard. The instructor pointed at the screen. "This is why we're here." Two trained officers made a choice based on nothing but a feeling. They ignored proper procedure and ended up arresting someone who was innocent. And not just innocent, but a judge. Dillard's face burned. Seeing it from the outside, it looked even worse. The instructor's voice grew firm. "Now imagine if she hadn't been a judge. Imagine if she had been a regular person without influence, without a title. Would she have had the same chance to defend herself? Would anyone have listened?" The room was silent. Carter swallowed hard. "No," he admitted quietly. Dillard didn't speak, but in his heart, he knew the answer too. This training wasn't just punishment. For the next few weeks, Officers Dillard and Carter went through the toughest training of their careers. The sessions weren't just about rules and regulations. They were about mindset, perception, and responsibility. They watched real-life videos of officers making bad decisions and the terrible consequences that followed. They listened to experts explain implicit bias, how people make judgments without even realizing it. At first, Dillard wanted to push back. He wanted to say, "I'm not biased. I was just doing my job." But the more he listened, the more he saw things differently. One session hit him harder than the rest. A guest speaker, an older man with gray hair and kind eyes, stood in front of the class. His voice was calm, but his words carried weight. "Years ago, my son was arrested for no reason," he said. "He was walking home from work when an officer thought he looked suspicious." The man paused, his fingers gripping the edge of the podium. "He spent the night in jail for nothing. No charges, no reason, just a mistake." The room was silent. Dillard clenched his jaw. He had never thought about what it felt like to be on the other side of an unfair arrest. The man continued, "That night changed him. He lost trust in the system. And no matter how many times that officer said sorry, the damage was done." His eyes scanned the room. "You wear that badge. People trust you. Don't break that trust." After the session, Dillard sat in his car for a long time, staring at the dashboard. He thought about Judge Harris, about the way she had looked at them, not with anger, but with disappointment. It wasn't just about one mistake. It was about what that mistake represented. Carter sighed beside him. "This whole thing has made me think," he admitted. "We weren't trying to be unfair, but maybe we were." Dillard nodded slowly. "Yeah." He ran a hand through his hair. "We messed up." Carter exhaled. "What do we do now?" Dillard knew the answer, but saying it out loud made it feel real. "We do better." The next day, the training ended, but the lesson stayed with them. They weren't the same officers who had stopped Judge Harris that night. They had changed. But one question remained. Would they get a second chance to prove it? A month had passed since the night they arrested Judge Harris. Officer Dillard and Officer Carter were back on duty. But things felt different. The way they saw their job, the way they approached people, it had all changed. The training had opened their eyes. They weren't just wearing badges. They were carrying trust. But the real test came one evening when they were patrolling a quiet street. A car had pulled over near a stop sign, its hazard lights blinking. A woman stood outside, looking frustrated as she checked something under the hood. Dillard and Carter slowed down. "We should help," Carter said. Dillard nodded. They pulled over and stepped out. "Ma'am, do you need assistance?" The woman turned, and their breath caught in their throats. It was Judge Monica Harris. For a moment, none of them spoke. Judge Harris stared at them, recognizing them immediately. Dillard felt his stomach tighten. This was it, the moment of truth. But then, Judge Harris did something unexpected. She smiled. "Yes, actually," she said, stepping aside. "My car won't start." Dillard exhaled, surprised but relieved. "Let's take a look." As they checked the car, Carter glanced at her nervously. "Judge Harris," he said, "I just want to say, we're sorry." Judge Harris folded her arms, listening. "We made a mistake," Carter continued. "Not just with you, but with how we think about our job. The training made us see that." Dillard straightened up from under the hood. "We're trying to do better." Judge Harris studied them for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Good," she said, "because that's what this was always about. Not punishment, change." Dillard felt something shift inside him. She wasn't holding a grudge. She wanted them to grow. Carter smiled slightly. "Looks like your battery is dead. We can call someone, or we can give you a jump start." Judge Harris nodded. "A jump start sounds good." As they worked, Dillard couldn't help but feel like this was more than just fixing a car. This was a second chance. A few minutes later, the engine roared back to life. Judge Harris looked at them with quiet approval. "Thank you, officers." Dillard and Carter exchanged a look. This time, the words felt different. They nodded respectfully. "No problem, Judge." As they watched her drive away, Dillard felt something new, pride, not just in wearing the badge, but in earning it. And this time, He knew they were on the right path, the right way to serve, the right way to lead, the right way to be officers. Because trust, once broken, is hard to fix. But tonight, they had taken the first step.